Hello and welcome to Build and Thrive, the podcast that is dedicated to improving the health and happiness of the construction industry. I'm your host, Jennie Armstrong, and as always, before we get started, I want to say a big thank you to our sponsors, GQR Scaffolding. So today's episode is one that I'm very excited about. It's a topic that I actually find really intriguing, not just from a construction industry perspective, but from a personal perspective and just general well-being. So I've been working quite closely with today's guest, Dr David Garley, who is a GP and also a sleep doctor. He's joined our Construction Health Network and shared some of his knowledge and his experiences of working with people with sleep disorders, but also looking at a bigger picture of how do we benefit wider organisations and what can they do to contribute to helping people sleep. So David, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Jennie.
Okay, so for listeners who may not have heard of you before, could you just briefly introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the type of work that you do?
Absolutely, yeah. So I'm David. I'm a GP, but also director of the Better Sleep Clinic. So within our clinic, we see patients with sleep disorders, a whole range of sleep disorders. So most commonly, this is things like insomnia, obstructive sleep apnea, and some circadian rhythm disorders. So we do this on a one-to-one basis, but we also work a lot with organisations because sleep is a really big part of how we show up for work. And the other group we work with is high-performance sports. So we work with Premiership football, the Olympic team, Formula One, really because of that importance of sleep in performance and recovery. So that's what we do in a nutshell.
Brilliant. And I suppose as a GP, what drew you to the world of sleep and why that was such an area you wanted to specialise in?
Yeah, good question. So I actually originally was a respiratory doctor, so a lung doctor working in a hospital. So that's where I first started working in sleep. And a lot of sleep disorders get managed by the respiratory team because a lot of sleep disorders relate to how you breathe when you sleep, things like obstructive sleep apnea. And respiratory as a specialty is interesting, but the treatments haven't quite kept up with diagnosis. So you can find out an awful lot about the condition, but you're often left wanting to do more. But I found sleep was a complete exception to that rule. But if you find someone who's got really good going obstructive sleep apnea, who is getting really poor quality sleep, falling asleep at work, sometimes falling asleep when they're driving, falling asleep when they get in from work, poor concentration, poor memory, often mimicking dementia in some cases because it's so bad, and in many cases depressed, that if you get them diagnosed, which is relatively straightforward, and treated with things like CPAP, which is a really good treatment for obstructive sleep apnea, that sometimes it's 2 days later that you're looking at a completely different person. And it's a really addictive place to work. I was absolutely hooked. And it really highlighted to me the importance of sleep in improving your health and well-being. That sleep, which is, to be fair, a slightly vague subject, that when you see the effect of that brisk restoration of quality sleep and how that can impact your life, I found it was absolutely fantastic place to work. So I since from that point moved to general practice, started the Better Sleep Clinic, and we do that as a more focused service now.
Yeah, I mean, is as a topic that I regularly talk to our clients about, and fatigue, I think we are starting to recognise how much of it an issue it is in like the construction industry. But I must admit, I don't think people fully understand what we mean by fatigue. And there's there's sometimes this focus on like shift patterns and the hours that people work, but not really understand from a health perspective what does actually fatigue mean and what does poor sleep mean. So do you want to just kind of give a little bit of your overview of how you would describe it?
Yeah, absolutely. So sleep and fatigue are clearly related, but they are actually a little bit different. So sleepiness is very much more nodding off, whereas fatigue is usually that more kind of physical exhaustion, mental exhaustion that you can get, which often relates more to medical conditions, mental health conditions as well, and to an extent sleep disorders. A good example I find to see that distinction is that if you had a very physical job, for example, perhaps in construction, that you've worked all day, and when you get in from work, if you sat down in your armchair and your phone was in the other side of the room and rang, you think, I really can't be bothered to get up, that you're exhausted, but you wouldn't necessarily be nodding off. So you've got that physical fatigue, but you wouldn't necessarily be sleepy. However, sleep disorders, things like obstructive sleep apnea, insomnia, these things, they can give sleepiness, but they can also give that fatigue. So they're definitely related, but they are slightly different.
Yeah. It's bringing back memories of my 12-hour shifts in A&E, and that's how I feel at the end of it. On a shift, I want to physically be able to move, and I think the mental exhaustion more than the sleepiness.
Yes, exactly.
And what I've been really interested in, and particularly when I speak to people about why this is an important topic, is kind of the research coming out that we're learning so much more about like poor sleep and how much that affects us as human beings. So yeah, just share your kind of perspective on what we know now about the impact of this.
Yep. So there's an ocean of evidence that supports this idea that poor sleep impacts our health. So there's physical components to this and mental health components. So from a physical perspective, so one big area is your cardiovascular risk. And a way of understanding this, if you think about what's happening when you're asleep, that your heart rate is lower, your blood pressure is lower. So it's a state of relative cardiovascular relaxation. And so if we think that you sleep roughly 8 hours a day, as that's roughly a third, so it's a third of our lives roughly that we spend asleep. So if you're habitually poor sleeping or short sleeping, you're spending a significantly increased amount of time in that more stressed cardiovascular state. And so these natural processes of arterial furring up that can lead to things like heart attacks and strokes and so on, this just happens at an accelerated rate, which is why there's such good evidence that poor sleep is a serious risk factor for heart disease and stroke and hypertension. In a similar way, diabetes actually. So if you're not sleeping well, a lot of diabetes clinics will actually pick this apart and try to understand more about what's going on with your sleep, because there was some research that showed that poor sleep should be seen alongside more traditional risk factors for things like type 2 diabetes, like obesity, because it does have that real impact on your metabolic health. And in terms of mental health, which is probably the area most researched, is the term that you'll come across is this bi-directional relationship between sleep and mental health. What that means is that it works both ways. So we've known for years that certain mental health conditions can disrupt your sleep. So anxiety can make it very difficult to fall asleep. Depression quite famously causes early morning awakening, not all the time, but quite often. But we know that it actually works the other way as well, and poor sleep will actually cause anxiety and cause depression. And why that is particularly relevant is that if poor sleep can be both a cause and an effect of a mental health condition, then as a system, it can feed into itself, and these things can really escalate. And so this is why people often find that both their sleep and mental health are getting worse. And we know from research that in those situations, it's very important to address both of those things.
Yeah, and I suppose the other bit is the Alzheimer's link that I've been hearing lots more about. And I actually find it quite difficult to talk to some people about, because when you share that with people who struggle with their sleep, there's a bit of moments they're like, well, you're putting yourself at risk. And in their perspective, they feel like they can't do anything about it. So yeah, anything on the Alzheimer's risk?
Yeah, so it's more when you look at populations. There is this system in the brain called the glymphatic system, which it's great to see that people still make up words in medicine. It doesn't really sound like
and no one knows what they mean.
Yeah, I know. So it's this kind of system that takes out waste products from the brain. And some of these waste products are things like tau and amyloid, which are the waste products or proteins that are associated with Alzheimer's dementia. And so there's been some research that shows on populations who don't sleep well that there can be an increased or an earlier onset of Alzheimer's disease. However, it's difficult to see how that applies to individuals, because a lot of this is multifactorial. And it's a very perceptive point you made, that you have to be cautious about how you bring up these subjects, because one of the drivers of poor sleep and insomnia is anxiety about sleep or worries about sleep. And so if you start ratcheting up that kind of pressure about sleep, and people start saying, I'm going to get dementia if I don't sleep well, that's going to make your sleep
the pressure's
worse.
on. Yeah,
and actually, it is an interesting book written on sleep by a guy called Matthew Walker, which
Why We Sleep. Yeah, I've read. Yeah.
Have you read it? Yeah.
Yes.
So I think he probably overemphasized some points, and some of that was about the risk to your health of poor sleep. But if you read the reviews on Amazon, it's full of people who read that book thinking they'd improve their sleep, and now they can't sleep at all. So I say the Amazon reviews actually make better reading than the book itself.
You perhaps need to bring out your own version then, David.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah,
in competition. Okay, so when obviously you've done a bit of work with the Construction Health Network and spoken to some of the construction organisations we work with. I mean, what's kind of your perception on the construction industry and how we're managing it, or how we're not managing it in the best way?
So I think there's so many aspects to work within construction that make you quite vulnerable to poor sleep. So a big one will be shift work. And I think there are certain industries where, so I think across the board, sleep is considered a slightly stigmatized subject, and people don't really feel able to talk about it. And particularly with early starts and hard work, that as sleep is almost universally disrupted within certain sectors of construction, that there is this feeling that you just need to crack on and just deal with it, which means that the subject doesn't go addressed. And I'm sure we'll talk about it in a bit more depth in a moment, but actually there's really good research about the risk of poor sleep within industries. And so I think there is a general feeling of the problem that's associated with poor sleep, but I don't think that perhaps it's been engaged with in perhaps the most effective way up to this point, speaking more generally.
Yeah, and I know probably, again, from my time, I see the focus has definitely been on working hours. And even though we recognise the individual factors, it's been like, what do you do from a risk management perspective from an organisation? And the basic response for sleep is like give them a toolbox talk and say, make the room dark and try and get 8 hours, which probably we can go to Google and find most of that stuff these days, but not really looking at the individual and what more can we do with those people. So one of the other things that I've come across when you speak to construction workers, it's almost a bit of one of those like, oh, man up type attitudes. And the culture around it is like, well, we work long hours. It's a bit of a badge of honour if I can get up and go to work after 4 hours sleep. And just because I don't need it, or, some people will say I don't need any more than that. I mean, what do you see about the culture? And maybe not necessarily always in construction, but there's this kind of attitude to sleep not being such an important issue.
Yeah, I think there's a good point. I think there's a few sort of components to that. Construction's difficult as a job, and I think people are in that mode of pushing through. I also think that poor sleep, people sometimes don't. I think sometimes it's seen as laziness, that sleep is sometimes, and rest is seen as laziness, when actually we would say that sleep and rest are key parts of performance. And it's that kind of real maintenance that you need for that sustainable high performance. I think sometimes it's viewed in a different way. I also think that sleep, people don't always think can be any better. And that's one of the biggest myths across the board with sleep. And this is one of the things that we really like to tackle head on, is that people don't think that their sleep can be any better. And you could imagine if you really felt that something couldn't be any better, then it'd be quite logical to take that let's just get on with it point of view, which is actually quite a kind of noble approach to take on it. But I think when people realise that things can be different, then I think that would loosen that view. And I think people would start to think and engage a bit more with sleep and think, what if I can make sleep better, what could I do? And then you start to get the questions, and then that's a really good way to start getting that engagement.
Yeah. I keep coming back to the conversations that I've had with my mum, and it's the classic, oh well, she has coffee too late, she's on watching screens, and when I try to engage in that conversation with her, I think she's like, well, I know what the answer is. I don't need to do all of these things, and I don't want to actually look at those and try and address those. I'm happy with the wine before bed. My mum doesn't listen to the podcast, so she won't mind, but she also would openly say, oh, I'm a bad sleeper and it won't ever get any better. Yeah, I'm sure you've met those challenges. I hope the people that come into the clinic are receptive to following good advice.
Yeah, I do. And I think it is important to meet people where they are. And actually, not everybody has the same approaches. I think it's from somebody who runs a sleep clinic. You've clearly got a horse in the race, and you want people to be taking their sleep seriously. But people do have mixed priorities. And it is about, you don't want necessarily to trigger this kind of life overhaul. Because firstly, that's unsustainable. But it's just about perhaps meeting in the middle and making some small changes. And we're never looking for perfection. That perfect sleep certainly doesn't exist. But if you can make some changes to make some improvement to your sleep at night, that you might get that knock-on effect during the day. It's just trying to find out what those steps are for that individual in front of you.
Yes, absolutely. Coming back to the construction environment, so again, what some of the things that I see that organisations do is that they'll say, right, to supervising the managers, you're putting people to work today. Your job is to make sure they are fit for work. And if they look sleepy, then you need to change the work or stop them working. And I find that that workers would never say, I don't sleep very well, or I haven't slept very well last night, and my safety is at risk. And also a supervisor and manager doesn't really know how to deal with those workers in those scenarios. Maybe they're not being given the right course of action. But I suppose for that population that are putting people to work, what are some of the kind of thoughts and recommendations that you would say to them about how they manage their teams and the support that they might need?
Yeah. So I think it's hard to understand the value of a question if you don't think there's any answer. So it's kind of again decided that people don't think they can fix sleep. So why ask about it? If you can't fix the shift work pattern, why ask about it? It's opening a can of worms. So I suppose the first point again would be that we can get things better. So that's the first thing. I think while there is that kind of universality with sleep, that we've all been sleep deprived and we know how it feels and we know we make silly mistakes. So we kind of know this kind of broad brushstroke idea that sleep is a bit risky if you're sleepy. But I don't think people necessarily know the details. I don't think people know about the significantly increased risk of serious workplace accidents with resulting in permanent disability that arise for people who are not sleeping well. There's statistics that if you sleep badly, that you are 8 times more likely to have reported an industrial accident in the previous couple of months. So these are like big hard statistics. So it's not just like slipping tea or dropping something. It's big accidents with big risks. So I don't think people are fully aware of those risks. Driving, which is a large part of one, getting to work, but then also when you're at work, that 1 in 5 road accidents are related to poor sleep. So 20%, 1 in 5, which is absolutely enormous. And it's not just falling asleep at the wheel. It is that misperception of risk, driving too fast, tailgating, overtaking when there's not space, missing your junctions, things like that. So across the board, I think if people were a bit more familiar with the risk, that people would be more keen to ask questions about it.
Yeah. And we talk about that from a driving perspective. I mean, how, if you said 20% of all kind of construction accidents had a sleep relationship with it in some way, which is a completely similar scenario to driving.
Yeah.
But again, we don't ask the right questions around that when we're doing investigations to say, well, actually, was sleep a contributory factor? Yeah, there's definitely been a trend I've noticed. And I think that comes back to a lot of people feel uncomfortable asking those questions. And equally, would they be open to sharing that as the truth about their actual sleep outside of work, or if they're struggling with the mental health or whatever? Yeah, it's an area that the conversations just don't seem to be happening or in the right way from what I see. Can we talk a little bit about safety critical element of it? So obviously, the logical thing is your action times are slow and things like that. But just, you said a little bit more about that risk-taking behaviours and things like that. Yeah. What's the research showing us about the link with safety?
Yeah, so I think some of the stats are a bit difficult to really engage with, but there's one that I really like, and it makes the comparison. So it's in the field, it gets called psychomotor vigilance testing. So they usually use simulators that are driving simulators. And it's a bit like the hazard perception test that gets done now for the driving test. But it's looking at your ability with this. And what they looked at, it was at what point errors happened. Now, in one set of the study, they gave people alcohol. And in another arm of the study, they sleep-deprived people. And actually, if you go 24 hours without sleep, it was fairly robustly associated with a blood alcohol concentration of about 0.1, which is over the drink driving limit. So that quite strong social unacceptability of driving while drunk, which we thankfully have. People wouldn't do that, but actually a lot of people probably would drive if they hadn't slept for 24 hours. And if you work shifts, that's actually quite easy to do. It's quite easy to pinch off 24 hours without sleeping if you've got finish your end of night shifts and you've got other commitments. But I think that's a really good way of understanding risk. And drink driving, we don't worry about people falling asleep. We worry about speeding. We worry about not getting that spatial awareness and hitting a car, not having that attention span. And across the board, that gives you risk.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Like you say, it's the acceptance of it, and I'm sure everyone can think of times when they've been put themselves at risk with that kind of environment. I suppose one of the things I try to get out of the podcast is like these practical steps. So if a construction company came to you and said, "Look, we think we've got a fatigue risk," well, we would say probably we know that there'll be some sort of element of a fatigue risk. What are some of the practical things that an organisation can do to start addressing this?
Yeah, so understanding the magnitude of the problem, because of that stigma that arises, because people don't say, "I'm not going to work because I haven't slept well." It's very much that kind of iceberg situation where the majority of the problem is actually quite hidden. I always suggest starting with a workplace sleep assessment or a team sleep assessment, which we would always say should be anonymous, because a lot of the only real way to get down to that detail is anonymous. So if people are worried about, I'm not coming forward about my sleep problems because I think it's sleep apnea and I'm worried about losing my license and therefore my job, that's important. If it's because someone has shift work and they struggle to sleep so much that they're taking sleeping tablets that they bought online and they get that hangover effect in the morning, and that's why they're not coming in, or that's why they had that accident, you won't get that unless you go anonymous. If it's about kids at home, because everyone knows if your children aren't sleeping, that you're unlikely to be sleeping. And 40% of the UK workforce are parents. So when you get that detail, then that can really shape your approach and you could be a lot more focused. And I think with any service that's using a workplace wellbeing scenario, it's not just providing the service, it's making sure you've got engagement. And so being relevant is a big part of that. So we'd always start with a workplace sleep assessment.
Yeah, and what might you do once you've got some of that data? I mean, obviously, looking at organisations like yourselves and the services that you offer, is there anything else that you then take that onto the next steps with?
Yeah, so what we know about people with sleep, so first we know that sleep disorders are really common. So insomnia affects 10% of the adult population. Sleep apnea, actually within construction groups, it could be as high as 30% because the risks are like age, carrying a bit of extra weight, being male, and that's a lot of the construction workforce demographic. That you could be pushing 30%. So sleep disorders are common, but we know that not everybody needs the same level of care. So some form of a stepped care approach is most effective. On-demand resources are good, particularly if you're in a shift working context. That if you have video resources and written resources that really deal with that particular sleep issue, then these will be very effective and they can be quite targeted. In terms of getting engagement, workshops are quite good. And again, if one of the problems is that sleep isn't really that active conversational subject, then this can really encourage that. And Q&A sessions, even if not everyone can attend, it's good to build this as a subject that people are allowed to talk about. And then there will always be people who need more specific support. So having a referral network on from there. So within our clinic, we've got a very diverse workforce. We have NHS sleep consultants, we've got GPs, specialist interest in sleep. We've got therapists. We've got an in-house diagnostic team. Being able to actually have that deal with those who are slightly more complex and need a bit more input, who can do the sleep apnea assessments and the treatment. So you've got a referral pathway onwards for those who require it. We would say, is the basics really that you should have for any workplace sleep strategy.
Yeah, no, and I'm thinking that relationship with occupational health and HR, and I suppose for a lot of those organisations, understanding where to go, because most of the responses will be go and see your GP. And I know you shared some stats about how long it actually takes to get treatment through the NHS at the moment. So, yeah, do you want to just share a little bit more about that? And I think I remember you sharing a bit of a case study specifically about how quickly you can get people back to work if they come via the route with yourselves.
Yeah. So if you've been stopped working because of risk of, for example, sleep apnea, first port of call is usually the GP. First issue, now I say this as a GP, but GPs, doctors in general most have no teaching on sleep at all as undergrads. If they have any, it's no more than an hour. So one big thing that we do is we do a lot of teaching for primary care for GPs on sleep, but sometimes things don't get picked up immediately. Once you do get referred, if it's an occupational issue, you should be prioritised. Because of resource limitations, not all NHS sleep clinics can do that. So it's not uncommon to be waiting 6 months, 9 months for your first appointment, which is the test. Once you have the test, you then have to be referred for treatment. And then you have to have a review on from there before you can be back to driving if you've been asked to stop driving. And so you could be pushing a year. And if you've got a year of sick pay, that's very expensive for the organisation. And if it's statutory sick pay, it's often very problematic for the worker as well. So our system, we get people first night on CPAP usually within about 2 or 3 weeks, which is much, much quicker. And then it's usually about 2 weeks on from there. So it's probably more like a month before we're getting people back to work. So there's a very strong financial argument for doing it that way. But more important than that, you've got a worker who is now diagnosed, treated, happier, healthier, and safer, who's back to work. And with sleep apnea, this is a really good example, because I think from an organisational point of view, people sometimes are unsure on how to approach sleep. That if we're being honest, sleep isn't exactly a concrete concept, like what's sleep? Not like other aspects of risk, which are a bit more tangible. So people have that natural hesitation. So sleep apnea is a really good example because it's a much more objective condition. There's a relatively easy diagnosis, a clear treatment which is mostly effective for people, and people get better quite quickly and they're back to work. So we always find this as a helpful one to talk about, because if you think, if I can fix this aspect of sleep, what other aspects of sleep could I fix? And it really targets this issue that people think they can't get sleep better. But if you can get sleep apnea better, perhaps there's some other aspects of sleep that could be better. It loosens up that very fixed view we have that nothing can change. So this is a really good example to hover on, to open up the discussion on sleep.
And I suppose is sleep apnea one of the most common conditions, or is there any other kind of typical conditions you regularly see in your clinic?
From a workplace setting, it probably is. Insomnia would be the next biggest one. So insomnia, there's actually more insomnia. So 10% of the whole adult population have insomnia, whereas with obstructive sleep apnea, it's a bit easier to look at patient groups because there are these quite clear risk factors that are quite different. Age, carrying extra weight. So if you look at males with probably an average UK BMI over 50, probably something more like 30%. Yeah, but when you're looking at, I'd say, university students, it's going to be quite different, whereas insomnia is a bit more consistent across the board. Yeah, so yeah, insomnia and sleep apnea, probably the two
most common ones. And one of the, well, we talked a little bit about giving advice to workers. Like, what are some of the kind of key bits of information to help people sleep better? And is there any like common myths and things that people say that, don't really make a difference? Or what? Yeah, again, I suppose your clinical experience maybe, but you've shared with some of your patients.
Yeah, plenty of myths. Yeah, you can't move for myths. So if you look anywhere online, you usually find mouth taping is one that's got
Oh yes, I've seen a lot of that. Yeah, my sister bought me
Yeah.
some for like Christmas last year, and I was like, "What's this for?" She said, "It'll make you look younger," but it wasn't about the sleep. It was to get rid of some of my wrinkles, but that didn't work either.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's it. A lot of these things are approached with, but people have different aims for doing some of this, but certainly it's not got the biggest evidence base. The other one I saw recently was dark showering, which sounds so like it's showering in the dark. I get the idea that it's warm and it's meant to be that kind of, I don't know, wind down and all that before bed, but what if you slip?
Yeah, my health and safety brain is saying.
Yeah, you're absolutely, you must be the red beacon going off. But so that's a problem with a lot of it. It's not really rooted in the real world. So there's an awful lot of myths. So if someone's doing shift work and struggling with their sleep, first question I would ask someone to consider is, on your night shifts, do you find there's some sets of night shifts you sleep better and others you sleep less? Some you sleep better and the shift goes better. Others you sleep less well and the shift is a lot more challenging. And then ask the question, what is the difference? Because people often attribute all of these sleep problems to the shift pattern. But in both examples, the shift pattern's the same. And this is a really kind of good example of loads of things with sleep. There's things that you can't change and things that you can. And actually, those things that you can change, they might not lead to perfect sleep. But actually, taking control of it can tip the balance in your favour and make things substantially easier. So when I did night shifts in the hospital, sometimes I slept fine and the shift was a lot better. And other times, something happened and I didn't sleep and the shift was awful. But these things are usually within your control. And it's just about going through those and finding out what it is. And actually, a lot of this stuff is actually low-hanging fruit. And it's a bit simple, but it's just about getting a framework for going through it. A lot of the people at my work were saying, "No, I didn't sleep well because I've got to get the kids from school or whatever time, or I've got to pick the dog up." It's like everyone's situation is different, but sometimes by restructuring your day, getting someone to help with a few things, putting a note on the door to the Amazon driver, don't ring the doorbell, stuff like that. You increase your opportunity sleep. So before you even get down with sleep medicine and how to sleep better, if you've broadened that opportunity for sleep, that can actually iron out an awful lot of problems.
Yeah, and actually I resonate with that because when we look at some of these longer shift patterns in construction, if they're doing 12 hours, or a lot of the rules are 14 hours door to door, particularly like in the rail industry, but they've only got 8 hours left in the day, or 10 hours left in the day if they're doing 14 hours to really use for that opportunity to sleep. So you've got to minimize what you do either side. If you're trying to get 8 hours, then you haven't got much of an opportunity to do much else, and it's literally get home, unwind, and then straight to bed. But that's probably not practical for a lot of people to actually achieve. Yeah. And do you see, like, coming back to the whole night shift thing? So again, one of the challenges sometimes is we see the amount of night shifts people do in a row. I mean, obviously your body's response, maybe you get slightly used to night shifts, but obviously naturally you see people's fatigue risk getting greater as the night shifts go on. Do you see anything specifically around night shifts, or is there like you shouldn't do more than 3 hours? I know that's 3 night shifts in a row. That seems to be guidance, but never really achievable for a lot.
Yeah, it's a good question again. And I think a lot of the research, it's not all of the research is apples with apples. So they're not necessarily all talking about the same thing. And what we found with organisations, when we've worked with organisations to talk about shift patterns and how it might be best, you've often got a bit of a conflict that you've got what could be considered best practice with shifts. People often talk about forward moving shifts, perhaps shorter shifts. Then that has to be fitted with what people want. And people often want to work longer, unfortunately, because they value their time out of work more than their time in work. And that tends to work out better, or at least the longer pay. And then from a workforce point of view, if you're having more shift patterns of shorter shift durations, then you need more supervisors and there's pay implications. So it's a very multifactorial subject. certainly shorter runs of shifts for shorter periods of time is better. But this is why it's important not to be necessarily too fixed in your advice, because you have to meet organisations where they are. And Rome wasn't built in a day. So if we can just nudge things a bit, get the ball rolling, it leads to improvements, and then we can where we are.
No, definitely. And I think even just coming back to your earlier point about understanding the population and how they are sleeping, because naturally that will say, right, well, actually, we have got a problem here. What more can we do? And if there are things they can do with the shifts, it's one element of improving that. And I think, like, if you're, well, again, typical construction worker, we find that they do work long hours. It's quite physically demanding, and they're often away from home. Don't always, if they're in digs, you often hear people just getting a sandwich out of the petrol station or whatever, and they don't really have that opportunity to eat proper meals. Is there really kind of key bits of advice you'd give to that population? Say, right, if you're going to do anything, try and focus on these things to help with your getting better sleep.
Yeah, I think taking a holistic approach is good. There's so much health advice around. We sometimes find that making it more basic is sometimes actually better. This idea of health, the 3 pillars, which is exercise, nutrition, and sleep. Because the funny thing about sleep is that people don't actually care about sleep, or very few people do. What people care about is what sleep supports in terms of daytime function, in terms of your concentration, your memory, your mood, your energy levels. So that's actually what people want, and that's multifactorial. So you mentioned about how nutrition can be a little bit challenging. If you're not eating great, then you do feel a bit lousy. If you're not getting exercise, then that quite won't help. And so I think with shift work, there's this a bit of a sort of bizarre imbalance. There's either no focus on sleep or there's too much focus on sleep. So if you're not doing well on shifts, if you're feeling lousy during the day and when you're working, it's not always just sleep, but getting out and taking care of your general well-being, doing a bit of exercise. So make sure you're covering all 3 bases, because that's the big thing with this 3 pillars idea, is it's not about one, exercise, nutrition, or it's about all 3 being
right. And is there any kind of personal things that you do to make sure that you sleep? Have you learned yourself what the key things that you need for a good night's sleep?
Yeah, I have. And it's good that you've made that into a personal thing, because it is personal. And sometimes the advice you read online is so unbelievably generic that it doesn't take into account that rich diversity we have as people. And it is different for everyone. So for me, I definitely need to wind down. I think anyone who runs their own business, like, is constantly the brain just never really stops. I find if I start looking at emails after or within an hour or so of bed, I actually can guarantee that I won't sleep. So just trying to be a bit disciplined on that. And if I have a lot on my mind, and this is something that we talk about with our insomnia patients, if you've got stuff that's popping into your mind, there's usually quite a good reason. It's usually something important, and it usually needs thinking about. So people often try these like elaborate techniques to try and stop thinking about something, but that never really works. So I always find it's helpful to actually lean into that and give the thoughts what they want, which is a bit of time thinking about them in a structured way for a period of time, 20 or 30 minutes. Really think about it. I often write stuff down, and then you can close the book on that situation. And I find that's a really good way to unburden my mind when I'm trying to sleep.
Yeah. And what about alcohol and coffee?
It's a hot topic. Alcohol, anyone who drinks will know that alcohol usually makes you fall asleep a bit quicker, but you normally get fragmentation later in the night. So most people's experience of drinking and then the subsequent sleep, is that it's of a more poor quality, which is actually true. So if you put electrodes on people's head and actually monitor their sleep, the sleep is disrupted. You might not even be completely awake, but there's light sleep and deep sleep. You tend to get a lot of light, fragmented sleep, which isn't so good for you. And coffee promotes wakefulness. So one of the main systems that controls your sleep is this thing called the adenosine sleep drive. So coffee blocks adenosine. So this is absolutely fantastic in the morning, or if you're perhaps on a night shift and you want to use a bit of caffeine to give you a bit of a boost in alertness. But right before bed is not necessarily that helpful. But as with all things, it's balance and moderation. And there's this concept in sleep. So like, if you try hard to sleep, you won't sleep. If you think too much about sleep, you'll actually sleep less. And this is really important when looking at sleep advice. So people who cut out all alcohol, who cut out all coffee to try and sleep better, which is actually nearly all of our insomnia patients, all it does is just build more focus on sleep and more worry about sleep. And it typically makes sleep worse. This is called sleep effort. And actually dismantling that is a key part of cognitive behavioural therapy for insomnia, or CBTR, which is the gold standard treatment for insomnia. So it is important to have a bit of flexibility about sleep. So I guess in one level, coffee and alcohol right before bed aren't so helpful, but a bit in moderation, and the way that it can promote that flexible view of sleep is definitely a good thing.
Yeah, and enjoying yourself at the same time. These are things that's important. I suppose just kind of coming towards the end now, is there anything, like if you were to say like in 5 years' time, like what you'd like to see in the construction industry, what would that look like about how we can improve people's sleep and their general overall well-being?
I think I'd like to see this conversation just a bit more open, because we've known for years that there are good quality treatments for sleep. There are effective treatments for sleep. But to access it, it needs to be an open subject. So I think that's maybe all I'd want is actually the treatments are already there. The referral pathways are already there. It's just getting people to get involved with it. So just opening up that conversation is, I think, all I'd want.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm thinking one of, a lot of our audience are health and safety professionals. And yeah, key thing for them to take away is like, let's go and have that conversation, try and understand a little bit more about the challenges that you've got. And I'm sure it feels like one of those topics when you start talking about it, all of a sudden you'll be hearing lots of people with those sleep challenges that quite often, don't go noticed. Yeah. And is there anything else, do you think, David, from your perspective, any other kind of key thoughts around where you'd like to see the world of sleep going? And obviously, there's things like technology coming out now. I regularly get contacted by people around like apps and things to help measure fatigue risk in construction. And do you see any kind of key things on the horizon that we need to keep an eye on?
So the funny thing with sleep is that we've actually, I wouldn't be blasé enough to say we've got all we need, but we've actually got really effective treatments.
No, good. Yeah.
That's what's odd, but it's probably scaling it. So there's this statistic about 85% of people with obstructive sleep apnea are undiagnosed. It is really about the implementation of the treatments we've already got and getting people involved. So a bit of a boring answer. But we've got all the stuff we need. It's just about getting people to get involved with it. Yeah.
Brilliant. Oh, thank you, David. And I really have enjoyed speaking to you a lot over the past year, and your knowledge and understanding of this as a topic. I'm sure if we get more conversations happening, we can definitely see the impact of that. If people want to get a hold of you, where's the best place to find you?
You can come to our website, which is www.thebettersleepclinic.co.uk. You can also drop me an email. So I'm david.garley@thebettersleepclinic.co.uk.
Brilliant. So thank you very much, David. And a big thank you again to our sponsors, GKR Scaffolding. I'm your host, Jennie Armstrong, and we'll see you next time.